Thank you to each of the witnesses for your testimony. Professor Blackman, prior to 1963, had any federal court issued a nationwide injunction blocking federal law or executive policy?
I'm not aware of any.
Would you agree that from the founding through the 20th century, the federal judiciary consistently understood its powers to be limited to the parties before the court?
Yes.
And would you agree that the widespread use of universal or nationwide injunctions, especially against presidential actions, is a recent development emerging in the last decade?
Yes.
That's important history, because what we're seeing now is not normal, and we have over 2 centuries of history when this didn't happen. It is instead a novel and dangerous concentration of judicial power. When a single district judge issues a nationwide injunction, are they acting as a constitutional judge or as a de facto national policymaker?
It's effectively a veto in the executive branch.
We've seen district judges block President Trump's policies on immigration, energy, birthright citizenship, and even federal hiring and firing, all prior to any appellate review, all without any input from Congress, all from one single judge. Let me offer an analogy. Suppose the federal government approves a plan to cut down trees in a national forest to make way for a pipeline. One person who occasionally camps in that forest files a lawsuit. The judge not only grants relief to that individual, but certifies a putative class action on behalf of all campers nationwide and issues an order blocking any tree cutting in any forest used by any member of the putative class across all 50 states. Professor Blackman, is that consistent with the Constitution's design for judicial relief?
No, it is not.
Or is that rather a recipe for nationwide paralysis based on a single courtroom?
Yes.
Would you also agree that the proper constitutional remedy is to address the plaintiff's actual injury, not to give one judge the power to halt activity unrelated to the case at hand?
Article 3 requires that.
And how does Article 3 require that?
Article 3 speaks of cases and controversies. As specific people have specific injuries. You cannot grant relief to broad classes doing a certain injury before the court.
And if broader relief is truly necessary, wouldn't that be better handled by class certification, by the appellate courts, or by Congress, not a lone district judge rewriting national policy?
Absolutely.
Can you explain how this pattern of nationwide relief not only intrudes on the president's Article 2 powers, but also undermines Congress's own lawmaking authority?
What ends up happening is you file many lawsuits in many districts seeking parallel relief, and it only takes one judge to grant the universal injunction. And once the judge grants the injunction, it's off to the races. Unless ruling stayed, the executive branch must immediately halt what it's doing. And this has really changed the way the executive branch and the courts have operated, as you said, over the past decade. And I think this time is ripe to actually address this issue and figure a way to stop this sort of insanity. We can't leave it to the Supreme Court to figure everything out.
And Professor Blackman, your testimony outlines structural reforms that Congress could enact to restore balance. Can you explain how requiring a 3-judge panel drawn from both district and circuit judges would deter judicial overreach and restore legitimacy to preliminary relief?
Well, this is how Congress ran things for much of the 20th century. They stopped in the 60s and 70s. The benefit of the 3-judge panel is you have diverse voices. In fact, even on this dais, you don't always agree with each other. But when you talk to each other, you find perhaps the closer truth. A single judge acting by himself or herself can often be like a god. There's no limitation on what they can do. But the benefit is if you have 2 circuit and 1 district, you're basically bypassing this next layer of review. Have the initial panel, 3 judges, and have managed review by the Supreme Court. We need to cut out this race to the Court of Appeals, this race to the Supreme Court. Let's compress the process and get to the result quickly enough so these issues of national significance are resolved fairly.
And by the way, if the characterization of these nationwide injunctions by my Democrat colleagues was accurate, if this was simply a result of, in their view, Trump's repeated lawless activities, one would assume a 3-judge panel would find the same ruling on the merits as a particular lone district judge. Is that correct?
In theory, but if drawn randomly, I think it's less likely. Random draws of three-judge panels would be a very good change to see how things would work out.
Well, and much like Sherlock Holmes and the lesson he derived from the dog that did not bark, in this case, when we hear our Democrat colleagues talking about this is simply enforcing the law, the dog that isn't barking is why do they keep going to the same handful of radical judges in bright blue districts? And why will every Democrat on this panel oppose any effort to require a three-judge panel for a nationwide injunction? And the answer is they know fully well that a fair panel would reject the vast majority of these claims. And at the end of the day, I think too many Democrat members of this body want to frustrate the will of the voters who reelected President Trump and elected a Republican Senate and a Republican House, and they're perfectly happy for lone judges to impose their own policy preferences rather than respect the democratic will of the voters. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you,